Hi there. Thank you for listening to #NATO Jobs, the podcast. My name is Julie, and I'm your host for this first season of conversations with NATO staff about working for the Alliance. Each episode, I have a chat with one of the staff members to discuss their experience. They give you an insight into their personal NATO journey from A to Z. What made them decide to apply to NATO? How do they feel their current job allows them to make an impact? And what would they say to someone who's thinking of applying? Welcome to the studio today, Tom Morin-Robinson.
Thanks so much, Julie. It's really a pleasure to be with you.
How are you today?
I'm great. I was I was a little bit excited for this podcast. I was thinking about it last night, and it almost felt a little bit like redoing a job interview. So I started getting a little bit nervous, but then, ideas started coming together, and I think it'll be a fun conversation.
Yeah, I think it will be, and no need to stress, although, as I just confessed to you, I always get a bit nervous as well. So could you tell us a bit about your background, Tom, both on a personal and a professional level?
Sure. Well, again, my name's Tom. I'm a program officer in NATO's Public Diplomacy Division. I've been with NATO for nearly 5 years now, working in a few different capacities, all around communications. And, personally, what to say? I'm in my mid-30s. I'm Canadian. I'm from Quebec. But I've spent most of the last decade living internationally in one city or one country or another, which has been a pleasure. Personally, I love to exercise. I love to cycle, and I love discovering new parts of new cities. So, yeah.
Okay. And you already mentioned your job title to us, but yeah, could you please explain in layman's terms what it is that you do on a daily basis?
Sure. So I do feel like I really need to zoom out a little bit on this. So I mentioned that I work in NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, which, to put it in the simplest terms, is NATO's communications division, our comms shop. But I think stopping there really does it something of a disservice. The breadth of what we do with a relatively small team is actually really, really quite wide. And I think as communicators, that gives us a really important job. We need to make sure that our publics know what we do, and understand how NATO is working to keep them and their countries safe. My little part of that pie involves, honestly, a lot of listening and a lot of talking. So I mentioned I'm a program officer in our engagement section, and really the nature of that role is to nurture what I guess we call strategic communities and networks, and also making sure the Alliance is getting face time with our publics. So what we're aiming for are longer-term, two-way relationships. And that really ranges whether we're speaking to members of parliament in different countries, whether we're speaking to students who care about what kind of work NATO is doing, or maybe even don't know very much about it and have a lot of questions. So we work with think tanks, we work with universities. We also work with really small civil society organizations, sometimes which have one or two people working in them, and youth groups.
And so basically the goal is there to bring the goal there is to bring NATO closer to those audiences and really make them understand what it is that we're doing.
Exactly.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of formality sometimes in how we interact with the public, and that's important. The work we do is serious. It's security and defense. Mm-hmm. But I think it's equally important to offer people a slightly more casual setting as well for them to be able to ask their questions and to be able to have a personal interaction with the Alliance.
Did you always know that you wanted to be in communications?
No, it's something I came to through I think a bit more of maybe an unusual path in my career. Even NATO in general was not always something that had been on my radar. I can sort of go through that a little bit. I think I have elements of my career that are more standard for working at NATO, and then other elements that kind of aren't. I studied.
That's interesting, especially those that aren't typical for working at NATO. I think our audience could be interested in that.
Yeah. Well, I studied political science in Canada as an undergraduate. I think that's relatively typical. Yes. And then after graduating, I took off to teach high school in Japan for 2 years, which I don't think is typical. I mean, I was completely off the grid in terms of security issues, but at the same time, completely immersed in an environment which was totally foreign to me. And so that was exciting. And so I think coming back from Japan, I knew I was interested in doing something internationally, but that leaves a lot of doors open. So, of course, I think when you still have questions about where you're headed and how your career is going to look, well, you go back to school, which is what I did. And I decided to go to graduate school in Europe, which now I think we start moving more towards a more typical path. I studied international relations, I studied public administration, and I started getting more attuned to politics and international relations in Europe, which I think is a part of the world by virtue of the European Union and by virtue of all these countries kind of working together and sharing different elements of sovereignty, is a place where I think international relations is more active than in a lot of other places in the world. And being Canadian, you start building a bit of a more transatlantic consciousness living and working in Europe. I wrote a thesis on climate issues. Again, I wasn't quite thinking about security just yet, but I found myself interning in the Czech Republic in a think tank that was working on hostile information and disinformation, sharp power, how nation states were kind of leveraging information to their advantage to get a leg up in the international system, and that was the beginning, I think, of something clicked. Yeah. And
that's really interesting. It's something that also came up in the previous podcast, that sometimes based on certain coincidences or certain events in life that maybe don't seem that worthwhile or that conscious choices, like it can really define your path, basically.
Yeah, no, very much so. And I think from there I was sort of on the rails a little bit at that point. I mean, I ended up at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, which is a major transatlantic think tank, specifically has this kind of mandate of rapprochement between Europe and North America. I was working out of the Paris office there, doing policy research and also convening. And I'd applied at the same time for an internship at NATO. And so I didn't go through a war studies program. I wasn't a military history geek or anything. I cared about security. I cared about so-called high politics, and the kind of work that's discussed at the organization. But what I think drew me to apply, and what really interested me was multilateralism and international cooperation. And again, NATO, 31 countries, soon to be 32, dealing with security and defense. And that's questions of your country's safety, your country's borders, your country's people. I mean, these are, I think, naturally an element of national sovereignty that hits really, really close to the core of what countries and states have kind of found to be important. And part of what I found so fascinating at NATO was countries being willing to do this work collaboratively, to come together, to find common approaches.
Yeah, exactly.
And to me, security internationally really is a kind of bedrock that allows us all to thrive and to live peacefully in a complicated and interconnected world. And just personally, I find it too important to be left to one country, too important for us to be working in our own corners on this. We need to be working together. And that's what's happening at NATO. And that's what really attracted me. I was like, how can we take something like security and find a way to do it collaboratively?
And so then you come here to NATO as an intern, and then what happens?
Yeah. Well, there was no getting coffees. I can tell you that, I mean.
Good for you.
Yeah. It was a phenomenal program, honestly. And I really have to recommend it to any young person who is considering working at the organization. If you're ready for it, you'll rapidly find yourself doing very real work on your team, and contributing to the day-to-day of what's happening, I interned in the strategic communications unit of the public diplomacy division. And, I was there for 2 years, and a little bit more. I mean, there's so much to learn. The organization is so complex, but I had a great time doing it.
And for people thinking of applying to the internship program, would you say there's like a typical profile of an intern?
I think in the experience I've seen and in the cohorts that have come through, right? I mean, the internship program takes, you probably know better than me, but about 30-ish people twice a year. So you have a lot of people coming through, and you have different profiles. You have people I've seen who are just out of a bachelor's degree in their early 20s. You have people coming out of a master's degree. You have people who are coming out of a doctoral degree who already have a fair bit of experience. So you have this diversity. But I find often what's attractive in there is that you have a bit of experience working in a large, complicated, multi-stakeholder organization. Again, NATO consensus-based decision-making at the top, but also a big internal culture of consulting, of reaching out to the different experts we have around the house, and having an understanding of the complexity of the organization and where you can go to get information, help, support, advice. And I think having some experience in government usually prepares you a little bit to do that kind of thing. NATO continues to adapt to a new working environment, as we establish new areas of business, like working in innovation, working in tech, having a tech accelerator. I think you'll see lots of opportunities for people who might have experience in the private sector, might have experience in startups, or have a diversity of a background, find a place for themselves at NATO. So there's lots of different types of jobs for different types of people.
And you yourself, you come out of the internship program. How do you feel it has helped you or has allowed you to evolve as a professional, being a young professional at NATO?
I found myself, honestly, having to get myself up to speed really quickly. And I'm really grateful for the opportunities that I was given there, because it was challenging. And that's what I wanted and needed at the time. And I think if you're incoming as an intern, I mean, my advice is always take every opportunity you're presented with. If you think, oh man, I've never done that before, that's new to me, I think it'll be hard, do it anyway. And people will be ready to help you. And you'll have come away, I think, having gone through a challenge, but having realized that you can do it. And you can do it not by yourself, but with help, I think, of very collegial colleagues, which is something sometimes you look at a big multi-stakeholder, serious organization working on serious, security and defense. You have all these military colleagues. You think, oh man, it's going to be very, very serious, very formal, unforgiving maybe. And NATO is anything but. I mean, exactly. In the different places that I've worked in this house, people are so warm, so collegial, despite coming from all these international backgrounds, all these different countries in Europe and North America. And that's not even the only diversity you have, right? I mean, you have, again, colleagues who have had a long career in the armed forces. You have colleagues who are diplomats. You have colleagues who have gone through think tanks. You have young people, more experienced people. You have all this diversity. And I find people just really come together with, with a passion for what they're doing, a readiness to help and to contribute and to really do their best, and that's something, that warmth surprised me. Now that I'm here, it doesn't surprise me, but I think if putting myself before I arrived, I was ready for something very serious. Yeah. And we take the work seriously. Don't get me wrong, but that warmth is really there.
Same for me. Before starting working for NATO, I was like, oh, that's like a big black box and I do not know what to expect. And it scared me a bit. Like you said, I thought it could be a very unforgiving environment. Yeah. And then I joined and I was like, ooh, this is one of the warmest environments I have ever worked with. And I think because of that diversity, it makes it a very rich soil for people to thrive and want to evolve and work together. So, that's very recognizable, what you're saying.
Yeah. And I think that conversation that often takes place about international communication skills, I think that's important, but I think often you sort of get that confused for, I know everything about the mores of this culture or that culture. But I find often, and what's served me well here and anywhere that I've worked, including when I was in Japan and the only non-Japanese person in the entire school I was working in, it's about how you communicate. It's about communicating clearly with concision, but also about conscientiousness and empathy. I mean, these are totally cross-cultural, and I think if you're bringing those kind of skill sets to the NATO environment, you'll succeed.
Yeah, Tom, you're mentioning that a lot of the colleagues, they're very helpful and everybody is in this together. That also makes me think, of course, that there's a lot of challenges that you're faced with on a daily basis. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the reality is this is still a very big and complicated place. And I think definitely when you first arrive, there's an immense amount to learn. And your colleagues are congenial, they're there, but they're also extremely busy. There's a lot of work going on, and you do have to do a lot of reading, a lot of listening, a lot of educating yourself on the breadth of what NATO is working on. And I've been here for almost 5 years now. I still learn something new about what the organization does on like a weekly basis. And I think it does take a long time before you really feel comfortable with the understanding of the work that happens here. I think longer than at certain other places, just by virtue of, NATO doesn't stop at the headquarters in Brussels, right? There's all these other elements of the work we do, missions, operations, and a long history as well, going back to 1949, all of which... all of this stuff comes and shapes how NATO is perceived in the world also. And so when you communicate, you're never in a vacuum, and yes, there's everything going on today, whether it be Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, or any other aspect of the work NATO does, but you're still also communicating in this overall context of everything that's come before you when you arrived at NATO. So you do really need to be ready to learn, to put in the time to do that. I think you come away richer for it, but it's a challenge.
Any other tips or advice you would like to share with the young professionals that are listening today?
Well, continuing that train of thought about the footprint of the alliance, if you're really interested in working for NATO, my best piece of advice is to cast your net widely. There's a lot of places you can work, and a lot of places that get you into the orbit of the organization. So, absolutely apply for our internships at NATO headquarters. Look at the many temporary posts that we have open as well as a young person. Look at the careers that are also open. But remember that you can also work at the military side of things, even if you're a civilian. You can work at our procurement agency. You can work at our communications agency. You can work at NATO's Parliamentary Assembly. There's a load of places that have internships, that have opportunities for young people, that get you working at NATO. And, I think whether you come in one place or another, you might find yourself really liking it, sticking around, and also then moving from one place to another. I myself, when I was working on a contract basis, found myself working in Norfolk, Virginia at Allied Command Transformation, which is sort of one of our military strategic commands that works on forward thinking about the future of warfare and of the international security environment. And that was really exciting. And it was before I'd arrived at NATO, not something I knew very much about. And so even just internally, there's these opportunities to move and to learn. I'd say also look at your national representations to NATO. There are pathways. If you are a young person in your armed forces, there's definitely some ways to find yourself at NATO. Same thing if you're in other elements of your national service. That can be really exciting. So there's lots of ways to get here. And so I think if you're really interested in doing that, make sure you explore all of them. Yeah.
Yeah, and especially for the young people listening out there, or maybe the less experienced people, I should say, don't forget about our Young Professionals program either. It's a very nice one next to the internship program as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think one where you still get to rotate through 3, if I'm not mistaken, different NATO bodies. I mean, that's an exceptional program. Not one I did, but I wish I had. I was already here, but I remember when it was the first cohort was done a couple of years ago, and it's a fantastic program. So really, really one to look at.
Exactly. I have one last question for you, Tom. You touched upon it slightly already, about the moving around part. Of course, you have quite a bit of international experience now again at NATO within a highly international context. What was it like for you to move to Belgium?
Yeah. Well, I was in Paris right before I moved to Belgium. And, Paris is Paris, right? The scale of it, all the art, all the culture. But it's an extrememly frenetic, high energy place.
I've lived there myself, and I can confirm it's pretty stressful.
Exactly. There's this kind of ambient stress in the air. It's the same thing if you're in Manhattan or something, walking, people are walking very, very fast, and suddenly you find yourself walking very, very fast and being very stressed out. And I remember kind of getting off the train and arriving in Belgium, and I was just like, this is...
I can breathe again.
It's much more relaxed. Yeah. I take my bicycle to work, and it's also not just a city of diplomats. I mean, yes, the EU's here, NATO's here, all these other bodies are here. But it's a whole city beyond that. And I've really found myself at home here. It's a lot of fun. There's lots of culture. There's lots of, great restaurants, fun places to go, green spaces, you name it. So, I was kind of happy when I arrived, and maybe again it was just that Paris contrast. I mean, if you're listening to this and you're from Paris, I love Paris. I love going back, but for living, I've enjoyed being here in Belgium.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, Tom. Is there anything else you would still like to add?
Well, I'll just say, if you're thinking about coming to work for us, I feel pretty comfortable saying you'd be in for a pretty exciting and rewarding ride.
Okay, well, let's wrap up the podcast on that positive note. Again, thank you for your time, and I hope you as a listener, you enjoyed what Tom had to say, and it made you think of a career at NATO. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Julie.
And to you, our listener, thank you for listening to today's episode. If you thought the conversation with Tom was interesting, please stay tuned for our next episode. I'll have a talk with Yannick Petry. Yannick works in NATO's Defense Investment Division, and together we'll discuss working for a value-driven organization, resilience, and mentorship. If today's conversation sparked an interest to work for NATO, please have a look at our website, nato.int, so that's nato.int, and click through to our career section.